Welcome back again to Advanced Programming Concepts using C++. I did want to continue with processing parallel arrays, and I think we got into it a little bit in the last lecture. And I wanted to show you a little bit more of a visual example when we wanted to process parallel arrays. So let me give you a little bit of a visual as to what we can use as a reference when we're processing parallel arrays. So last time I talked about an array with 5 elements. And data types were different, right? Where this was a string and then this was an int. This represented the names of the employees, and then this represented the hours of the employees. So we can draw a little bit of a link here where we can call this person 1, person 2, person 3, person 4, and person 5. And we talked about the names, right? So John, Steve, Lucy, Mike, and Jim. And then the hours would be something 10, 15, 30, 40, and then 50. I also talked about adding an additional array. So again, we're talking about a data structure where each individual array would represent a piece of data, right? So if we added on an additional array here, you'd have an ID, right? And maybe the ID isn't necessarily an int, it could be another string. So that now these link together and you have person 1, same thing, person 2, person 3, person 4, and person 5. And we could have 101, 102, 103, 104, and 105. As I add on arrays, notice that 1, they're the same length, and that's the way it should be, right? And then 2, if I want to access the first person, the index is always going to be 1, right? Well, 0, right? So 0. So the 0th index would represent this whole row here, right? And then the first index would represent this whole, not row, but column, right? Then 2 would represent this whole thing all the way down. And 3 would represent this whole thing all the way down. And 4 would represent this whole thing all the way down. So if I did names of 0, hours of 0, and ID of 0, essentially we're talking about the same person, except we're taking each individual piece of data for that person. Because again, we're at the 0th index and represents this here. So this would be John, this would be 10, and this would be his or her ID 101. Right? So in that sense, when you process parallel arrays, or when you use parallel arrays, you have to keep in mind how to construct your arrays. Separate your data, and then as you separate your data, you kind of want to build each individual array with its own data type, right? So the names would represented by a data type of string, the int for the hours, and then the ID would be a string. So let me show you back. Let's go back to the program that we wrote. So here I created, barring the totals, right? Because we were talking about processing array contents. I created an array of 5 elements, and here we're representing the string of names, the hours, and then we're going to add on one more thing, which is the ID. Okay? So as I enter and populate the employee information, I'm also going to add the ID. Okay? And we don't have to change the index, because remember, when we're at the 0th index in our drawing, we know that we are on this column here, right? We're looking at this here. In our case, it's empty. We're not going to have data there. As we go and fill it up, it's going to get filled up. And then now, when we compute the pay rate, right, for the employee, we know which employee we're at because of the index. So if we're at 0, we know that we are in John. If we're at 1, we know that we're in Steve. And then as we go on, we know which one it is because of the index. So the index represents each individual value for each array. Okay? So what we'll do to make this easy is, aside from the name, we will say that we also have the employee ID. So employee ID, and then ID. Notice how I don't have to change I. And now what we could do is we do the following. We'll run that. We'll do John. Oop, I mislabeled. Enter the employee name. Enter the employee ID. Mislabeled here. So John 101 10. Steve 102 20. Jim 103 30. Lucy 104 40. And Bill 105. I'll do 38. And this is my result, right? As I print out the values and do the calculations, we have employee ID 101, right, which is what we typed in above. And as we go through, we can keep adding elements. And this is what we call using these parallel arrays, where each array is going to represent a column or a piece of is a data point in your problem. Okay, and we're going to start using a lot of this when we're processing files and data in general. So I just wanted to touch upon that. I know last video I touched upon the parallel array part, but I wanted to explain it a bit more just so you understand what the logic is and the thinking is when you're processing data. Okay, and right now the data is coming from my input, but eventually we're going to get to a point where we're going to process the data from a file. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that little bit of a nugget of wisdom. And on the next video, we'll talk about passing arrays to functions.